A cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
The truth about what was hidden beneath Gene Hackman's property is finally beginning to surface. And if the story that investigators allegedly uncovered is true, then the events surrounding his final days may have been far more complicated than the simple explanation that first appeared in the headlines. For decades, the property stood in the high desert of New Mexico as a private retreat belonging to one of Hollywood's most recognizable actors, a place most people would have assumed was simply another secluded celebrity estate. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Every subscription helps us bring you more stories, mysteries, and investigations like this one. Then came February 26, 2025. Federal agents arrived at the Santa Fe property expecting to investigate the deaths of a 95-year-old man and his 65-year-old wife, not to uncover a mystery hidden beneath the house. Inside, they found a scene that appeared tragic but initially straightforward. An unlocked front door, medication scattered across a bathroom counter, a dog that had died inside a closet, 2 other dogs wandering the grounds, and the bodies of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa. Betsy had apparently died weeks earlier, around February 3rd, while her body remained undiscovered inside the secluded property. Hackman's eventual cause of death was reported as cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's disease listed as a contributing factor, a conclusion that seemed to bring the investigation toward an ordinary and heartbreaking ending. But according to the story surrounding the property, the investigators were about to encounter something that would make the official explanation feel incomplete. Somewhere inside Hackman's private library was a wall that did not behave like an ordinary wall, and behind it, according to this account, was something that had never appeared in the public record: a hidden passage leading deep beneath the estate. What began as a routine investigation would therefore become something much stranger, because the deeper investigators allegedly went, the more the property began to resemble not a celebrity home, but a carefully constructed fortress, hiding a history that stretched back long before Hackman ever owned it. To understand why that discovery would matter, you have to understand the property itself. According to the narrative surrounding the estate, Hackman's home was never simply a secluded celebrity retreat. It was described as something much closer to a private security installation, built into the high desert landscape with layers of protection that seemed excessive for an ordinary residence. Richard Castagnano, described as a security consultant who spent decades working with diplomats, defense contractors, and wealthy executives, allegedly encountered the property during an insurance evaluation in 2019 and initially believed there had been some mistake with the address. He had reportedly worked around embassy compounds and facilities belonging to people who had genuine security threats. Yet the systems surrounding Hackman's estate allegedly reminded him of those environments. The property covered approximately 23 acres of dense forest, creating a natural outer perimeter, while tall stone walls and reinforced gates created another physical barrier around the residence. Motion detection systems were supposedly positioned to distinguish between wildlife and human movement, while thermal cameras provided overlapping fields of view designed to eliminate blind spots. Taken individually, none of these features would necessarily prove anything unusual. Wealthy people sometimes build elaborate security systems around secluded homes. But the story becomes more intriguing when those systems are viewed together, because the alleged design suggested that whoever planned the estate had thought carefully about how someone might approach it, where they might enter, what they might see, and how their movements could be detected. Castagnano's alleged reaction was that the property contained infrastructure more sophisticated than what he had encountered around some high-profile diplomatic facilities. If accurate, that would mean the security was not simply about protecting a famous actor from curious visitors or unwanted attention. It would suggest that someone had designed the property around a threat that required a much higher level of protection. And the strange details supposedly continued once you moved beyond the perimeter. Inside the residence, the security infrastructure was described as containing multiple layers of redundancy, including separate power systems, serving areas considered particularly sensitive, hardened communication lines that allegedly did not appear on ordinary property schematics, and a backup generator capable of maintaining operations far longer than a typical private household would ever need. The staff, according to the account, were carefully selected and thoroughly vetted, with non-disclosure agreements allegedly covering not only what employees saw and heard, but also the work they were asked to perform. Yet even those precautions were not necessarily the most important part of the story. The real questions began when former contractors allegedly started remembering the kinds of construction projects they had been asked to complete beneath the property. One contractor, Miguel Reyes, was described as having spent decades working on structural projects in Santa Fe and receiving a call in the early 2000s for what he expected to be routine construction work at Hackman's estate. Instead, he allegedly encountered sections of the lower structure where walls were specified to be approximately 18 inches thick, construction that he believed was far beyond what would normally be required for storage or a conventional basement. According to the account, Reyes questioned what the space was intended for and was told simply that it was storage, an explanation he reportedly found difficult to accept. He allegedly received unusually high compensation and signed a lengthy non-disclosure agreement, while other contractors handled portions of the deeper construction that he was never permitted to see. Reyes was supposedly told that the lower levels he had heard about did not exist, a claim that became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the work he had personally been asked to perform. And that is where the story takes its first major turn, because if the underground structures really existed, then the question was no longer why a celebrity had built an unusually secure home. The question became what, exactly, had been constructed beneath it, and why had so much effort allegedly been devoted to keeping the answer hidden. The answer, according to this narrative, began with the discovery of a wall inside Hackman's private library. On the morning investigators entered the property, a forensic specialist was supposedly examining the wooden paneling as part of a standard search for concealed compartments or unusual structural modifications. It was not necessarily the kind of procedure that anyone expected to produce a dramatic discovery. Investigators routinely inspect walls, floors, furniture, and other areas where evidence might have been concealed. But one section of the library allegedly responded differently when it was examined. A portion of the wall, approximately 4 feet wide, reportedly produced a hollow resonance instead of the solid sound expected from the surrounding structure. The panel appeared seamless from the outside, but closer inspection allegedly revealed a concealed mechanism. When the correct pressure point was found, the wall shifted, exposing a narrow passage cut directly into stone. According to the story, steps descended into darkness, disappearing beneath the library floor and leading toward a section of the property that had supposedly never appeared on any publicly available plans. The air rising from the passage was described as cold and damp, carrying the unmistakable atmosphere of a space that had remained enclosed for a very long time. Yet the tunnel did not appear completely abandoned. The account claims that portions of the walls showed newer reinforcement and that electrical conduit had been installed along the upper edges, suggesting that someone had returned to the underground structure long after its original construction. The passage reportedly descended hundreds of feet before opening into a much larger chamber, transforming what had initially looked like a hidden compartment into something far more substantial. And once investigators allegedly reached that chamber, the mystery surrounding Hackman's property became something much larger than a secret basement. They were supposedly standing inside a vault containing decades-old crates, photographs, documents, and markings whose meaning remained uncertain. That alleged chamber is where the story becomes almost impossible to separate from speculation, because the objects supposedly found inside would have extraordinary implications if they were ever authenticated. The account describes dozens of wooden crates lining the walls, some intact and others deteriorated, with their contents scattered across the stone floor beneath layers of accumulated dust. Yet certain areas of that dust were allegedly disturbed, creating the impression that someone had entered the chamber before investigators arrived. Among the objects supposedly recovered was a leather-bound ledger dated 1947, filled with names, dates, and financial figures written in German. Another crate allegedly contained dozens of fragile photographs depicting men in military-style uniforms that did not immediately correspond to any recognized armed force. Some photographs reportedly showed unidentified gatherings, while others depicted locations that investigators could not immediately identify. Most disturbing, according to the narrative, were photographs in which certain faces had been deliberately removed, as though someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that particular individuals could never be recognized. One image allegedly showed a group of men standing near what appeared to be the entrance to the same underground passage investigators had just discovered. If such a photograph were genuine, it would raise an obvious question. Why would people have been standing at that location decades before Hackman became associated with the property? But the most mysterious discovery was not the photographs or the crates. It was the wall itself. According to the account, hundreds of symbols covered the stone surface from floor to ceiling, some resembling ancient or medieval notation, others appearing strangely technical, while a third category supposedly matched no known system at all. Whether these markings represented an actual code, historical inscriptions, modern fabrication, or something much more ordinary would require careful archaeological and forensic analysis. Yet, within the story, they became the final clue that transformed the underground chamber from an unusual architectural discovery into an alleged mystery spanning generations. And then came the detail that gave the entire story its darkest conclusion. At the far end of the chamber, supposedly hidden behind a collapsed stack of crates, investigators encountered an enormous iron door, roughly 8 feet tall and several inches thick. There was no obvious handle or conventional mechanism from the outside, only a heavily corroded locking system apparently designed to keep the door closed. The narrative claims that an analysis of the metal suggested that the door may have been installed decades after the original chamber was constructed, raising the possibility that someone had returned to the underground structure and deliberately reinforced it. The purpose, according to the theory, was not necessarily to keep intruders from entering the chamber, but to prevent whatever lay beyond the door from coming out. Even more dramatically, the story claims that thermal imaging revealed airflow beyond the barrier, suggesting that the space did not simply terminate at the iron door. If true, that would mean the underground structure could extend farther than investigators initially realized, potentially connecting to another chamber, tunnel, or ventilation system. But this is precisely where the story crosses from an alleged discovery into territory that demands extraordinary evidence. Claims about hidden government installations, unexplained symbols, secret networks, anonymous trusts, or decades-long custodial roles cannot be established simply through dramatic descriptions. They would require authenticated photographs, property records, engineering surveys, forensic reports, and independent confirmation from credible sources. Without that evidence, the story remains a mystery narrative rather than an established account of what actually existed beneath Gene Hackman's property. And perhaps that distinction is the most important part of the entire story, Because the real question is not whether a dramatic secret sounds possible. The real question is whether anyone can prove that it was ever there in the first place. Miguel Reyes had worked on foundation and structural projects in Santa Fe for 30 years. He understood concrete the way a master craftsman understands his material, intuitively, at a level that goes beyond instruction. When he received the call about the Hackman property in the early 2000s, he expected routine work. It was not. There were sections of the lower structure where they specified walls 18 inches thick, Reyes recalled. That is not storage. That is not a wine cellar. That is bunker-grade construction. I asked what the space would be used for. I was told storage. You do not build storage like you are preparing to survive a detonation. Reyes was paid 3 times his standard rate and signed a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting him from discussing the project for 20 years. That agreement expired in 2024, 1 year before Hackman's death. When investigators asked Reyes to describe the full scope of what he had built, he could not, because he had only worked on one section. Other contractors handled the deeper work, specialists operating under a different tier of confidentiality entirely. Reyes was told those lower levels did not exist. He was told that more than once. But Reyes was not the one who found what was actually down there. That came 2 decades later, and it started with a wall that was not a wall. When Dr. Patricia Okino arrived at Gene Hackman's property on February 26th as part of the initial FBI response team, she expected the quiet stillness that settles over places where elderly people have died peacefully. She was not prepared for what she encountered. "Something felt wrong the moment I stepped inside," she said later. The house looked as it was supposed to look, but the details did not align. Furniture appeared to have been moved recently. There were ghost impressions in the carpet where pieces had stood for years, accompanied by fresh displacement marks suggesting recent repositioning. Scuff patterns on the hardwood floors did not match the movement of 2 elderly people with limited mobility, and documents in Hackman's study appeared to have been sorted through and then hastily returned to their original positions. 2 explanations presented themselves. Either someone had methodically searched the house room by room, or Hackman himself, during his final weeks, had been deliberately relocating things, ensuring that what he wanted discovered would be found, and what he wanted buried would remain hidden. Neither explanation fit neatly with the story of 2 elderly people quietly dying of natural causes. And the more Okino examined the house, the more the details seemed to suggest that someone had been moving through it with a purpose. The moment that changed everything happened in the library. Okino moved her hand slowly across the mahogany paneling, checking for hidden compartments. It was standard protocol. You do it not because you expect to find something, but because you cannot afford to miss it. Then she felt something different beneath her fingertips. A section of wall roughly 4 feet wide resonated differently when tapped. It did not sound solid. It sounded hollow, as though there was empty space behind the paneling. The difference was subtle enough that another person might have dismissed it, but Okino continued examining the surface until she found a seam so precise that it would have been nearly impossible to notice from an ordinary angle. Then she found what appeared to be the correct pressure point. The wall shifted, and what was waiting on the other side stopped her cold. Behind the panel was a narrow passage cut directly into stone, with steps worn smooth by decades of use and descending into absolute darkness. For a moment, the library no longer felt like part of a private home. It felt like the entrance to something that had been deliberately hidden from the world. Cold, damp air rose from the passage, carrying a smell that one agent later compared to opening something that had been sealed for a very long time, except this place did not appear to have been completely undisturbed. The tunnel walls showed modern reinforcement in several sections, and fresh electrical conduit ran along the upper edges. Someone, at some point, had apparently been maintaining the passage. The passage itself measured roughly 36 inches wide and descended at a steep angle, while the original stonework appeared nearly a century old. Whoever built it had not simply dug a hole beneath the property. They had engineered a structure intended to endure, and that immediately raised a more disturbing question. What had they intended to keep sealed inside? Okino reportedly stood at the top of those stairs for nearly a minute, considering whether she should continue. She later described the feeling as something she could not logically identify, but could not ignore either. "The danger was not anything I could identify," she said, "but my body was telling me something my training had no category for." Still, she went down. She stepped into the darkness and began the descent, moving deeper beneath the library and farther away from the ordinary world above. The descent reportedly took nearly 15 minutes. 312 feet below the library floor, the staircase finally opened into something much larger than a simple basement. It was a chamber, almost a vault, approximately 40 feet by 60 feet, with arched ceilings that Dr. Elena Vasquez, a local historian who had spent years researching the property's history, reportedly identified as consistent with Spanish colonial construction from the late 19th century. But the architecture was only part of what made the discovery significant. Vasquez's research had already uncovered a troubling history surrounding the land itself. The property had allegedly changed hands 7 times between 1920 and 1965, and each transaction was structured in a way that made identifying the true buyer extraordinarily difficult. Shell companies, anonymous trusts, and deliberately vague documentation appeared throughout the records, creating layers between the land and the people who actually controlled it. The deeper Vasquez went into the history, the less the paperwork looked like ordinary real estate documentation, and the more it resembled an intentionally constructed trail designed to make ownership difficult to trace. By the time investigators reached the chamber beneath Hackman's library, they were therefore not simply standing inside an unusual underground structure. They were standing at the intersection of a property history that appeared to stretch back decades, a construction project allegedly concealed from ordinary contractors, and a hidden passage that seemed to have been maintained long after the original structure was built. The buyer was nearly impossible to identify. Shell companies, anonymous trusts, and deliberately vague documentation had been layered together in a way that made it almost impossible to determine who was actually acquiring the property. What I found looks less like real estate records and more like a paper trail created by people who understood exactly how to disappear from one, Vasquez reportedly said. Then there were the surveys. Between 1945 and 1950, 3 separate geological surveys of the land were commissioned, and all 3 submitted incomplete reports. 2 of the surveyors left New Mexico within months of beginning their fieldwork, while the 3rd died in a car accident 6 weeks after his final visit to the property. 3 surveyors, 3 incomplete reports, 1 dead. According to the story, nobody had connected those details publicly until Vasquez began looking into the property's history, and what she discovered made the underground chamber seem less like an isolated secret and more like the latest chapter in a mystery that had been unfolding for generations. The chamber itself was filled with artifacts. 47 wooden crates lined the walls, some still intact, and others badly deteriorated, with their contents spilling across the stone floor. Dust covered everything in thick layers, the kind of accumulation that normally comes only after decades of neglect and undisturbed silence. Yet, near certain crates, that pattern was different. The dust appeared to have been disturbed recently, creating the unsettling possibility that someone had entered the chamber before the FBI arrived. If that was true, then the question was no longer simply what had been stored down there, but who had accessed the chamber, and why they had done so shortly before investigators entered the property. Inside one of the crates, agents allegedly found a leather-bound ledger dated 1947. Every page was filled with names, dates, and financial figures, all written in German. Another crate reportedly contained 63 fragile, yellowed photographs showing men in military-style uniforms that did not immediately match any recognized armed force from any nation. Some images depicted small gatherings in dimly lit rooms, while others showed locations that analysts were allegedly unable to identify. Several photographs contained individuals whose names had been removed with extraordinary precision, as though someone had deliberately erased every possibility of identifying them. Then, investigators supposedly found one photograph that brought the entire search to a halt. It showed a group of men standing in front of what appeared to be the entrance to the very tunnel they had just discovered. Based on the clothing and image quality, the photograph seemed to date from the 1940s. But two details made it especially disturbing. Two faces had been cleanly cut from the photograph. They had not been blurred, scratched, or covered with ink. They were simply gone, physically removed from the image, leaving permanent gaps where the identities of those people had once been. Whoever had altered the photograph had apparently decided that those two individuals could never be identified under any circumstances. For the investigators, the photograph raised a question that was impossible to ignore. If the image really showed the same underground entrance, who were the men standing there? And why had someone gone to such lengths to erase two of them from history? The crates were disturbing, and the photographs were worse, but according to the narrative, nothing prepared Okino for what happened when her flashlight finally swept across the far wall of the chamber.